Okay, students, today we're working on a chapter on governance, and there's some topics on tenure and executive meetings, those types of things. And I've asked Bobby Truhe, who's an attorney with KSB in Lincoln, and they really focus on school law. And so Bob's been generous enough to share his expertise and his time with us. And Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself as how you got into law and how long you've been doing these things, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, I graduated from law school in 2011 at Nebraska, and didn't really know that school law was even a practice area in and of itself. But kind of started to work on some projects with Karen Haase and Steve Williams. I think school law is one of the most interesting areas. Schools in general are, usually one of the biggest employers in town. They have the most unique issues. So I kind of gravitated toward that because I like some of the issues that schools as public employers, get to deal with that other employers, like in the private industry, for example, don't really have. We've got to worry about First Amendment rights of students and teachers, and we have to worry about whether, when we search a student's backpack for evidence of, a violation of school rules, whether we've done that in a constitutional manner. So I think that's fascinating. In addition to, school law really is everything. Like I said, there are contracts, there's employment law. So to me, it was just a fascinating area, and I gravitated toward it and just love working with school administrators and boards. And, the folks that I think we get to work with are some of the best clients that you could have in the state. So that's how I got into it. And then about a year ago, myself and Karen and Steve, we were practicing at a firm known as Harding and Schultz. That firm kind of dissolved. It no longer exists. It broke up into several other firms. And so we formed KSB School Law, focusing on representing public schools and related entities.
Very good. One of the things that I tell students at the start of these classes that there is a little difference between the hometown attorney who might be representing your school and an attorney who has expertise in school law. So, when I was superintendent, we always had a local attorney cover some of the little things, but basically it was a call to a school attorney. And I'd like to suggest to students that they, as principals, they meet with their superintendent and say, do I have authority to call these attorneys, or do you want to sit on it? So there's an understanding of what that role might be.
Definitely.
Let's talk a little bit about school governance. And one of the things that we run into is open meetings law, and what are some of the requirements of the open meetings law, and what are some of the issues that have come up, people who fail to appropriately plan for the open meetings law.
Sure. Well, I think the open meetings law is actually one of the areas where an aspiring administrator, whether it's a principal or then even becoming a superintendent, can help your board the most. You think about being the CEO of a private company, you don't really have all these restrictions in place, but that board is kind of counting on your expertise in this area to help them through it. So the open meetings law is actually only, about 8 statutes long. So if I was a superintendent, I would have a copy of that at all times. Even as a principal, any administrator, I'd want to make sure that one of the things that I could rattle off the top of my head was the open meetings law. So generally speaking, we see folks struggle with the basics. We really don't have too many instances where there's a really unique, sort of thing that a board is trying to do. And the question is, how does that fit into the open meetings law, or how might the open meetings law apply to it? We see schools struggle with basic things like whether or not the board in its minutes has designated a method for notice of publication of the meeting notice. So, whether that's, we're going to post it on the school's website, and we're going to post it, in 3 places all over town. We're going to put it in the newspaper. The board really is, it's at the discretion of the board to post it anywhere. But we've seen so often that boards, when we say, okay, you've got this open meetings complaint with the Attorney General, now show us where you've designated your method of posting notice of meetings, they don't have it. Likewise, creation of agendas, right? The agendas have to have agenda items on them that are specific enough to provide the public with, enough information to know what the board's going to talk about. One example that I ran into is I was dealing with a really complicated matter with the board with respect to collecting its tax money from the county. And I went up to the board meeting. I was planning to meet with the board, and on the agenda, all it said was Bobby Truhe, right? So while I'm happy to be, I was even talking to Karen and Steve, who have been doing this a lot longer than I have. It's the first time that just a school attorney's been an agenda item. So, as a member of the public, they would have had no idea that I was there to talk about a relatively complicated taxation and, kind of tax collection matter. And so formation of agendas. So, how we're going to publish the notice, what the agenda has to say, how many days before a meeting or how many hours or days before a meeting can we call it? How much time do we have before the meeting to amend the agenda? Do we have to publish the agenda? So some of these questions that are answered pretty basically by those, few statutes in the open meetings law are things that we see boards and administration struggle with. I think a lot of times you run into this is how we've always done it, which, by the way, is the worst legal argument in the world. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work because these laws are pretty clear. So, in terms of the general requirements of the Open Meetings Act, got to post notice of the meetings, got to do it in a timely manner. Do not have to post the agenda. A common misconception as well. We publish our agenda too. The law says the agenda just has to be kept somewhere. So if you say, we'll keep an updated copy of the agenda in the central office for anybody to come look at, that's perfectly legal. And it also then gives you the ability to be flexible if you need to amend that agenda for any reason within, no sooner than 24 hours leading up to your meeting. So at the 25th hour, you can still amend an agenda. And we've got boards that think that they're just stuck with the agenda they posted in the newspaper last week because the town paper only comes out every 2 weeks, and so we couldn't post another agenda. And it's just real basic stuff like that we see boards struggling with. And so
if they do post their agenda in the local newspaper, can they put a statement at the bottom that says this can be amended up to 24 hours before the next board meeting?
Yep. Some boards will do that. They elect to put the notice and the agenda. They elect to post both of those things. That's perfectly legal. If you don't have a caveat in there, like you said, Ken, that we can still amend this. And what I'd recommend too is something like the official agenda will be at the superintendent's office and it can be amended. If you don't, then the public has an argument, at least the argument that they make to the Attorney General on an open meetings complaint, is that really, even though the statute lets you amend that agenda, up to 24 hours before your meeting, really you've set a new standard as the board by publishing it and not indicating that you're able to amend it. So we typically don't recommend that you publish the agenda. You can email it to anybody you want to. You can do whatever you want with it, but we recommend not publishing it just so that you have that flexibility. But if you do, definitely include, that legal caveat in there that we can still amend it.
Is there a requirement? It seems like there was, that it has to be one copy of everything that's given to the board for the general public. Is that still true, or is that true?
Yep. So when you have a public meeting, you generally have the board packet, and that will, go out to all the board members. It's real slick how you can do it on a lot of these online systems now. But anything that the board has in its packet, any document that's going to come up for discussion in a public meeting, there does have to be a copy there, at least one, for the members of the public to be able to see as well.
Let's see, what else? Situations. Well, a question I have: is there such a thing as an emergency meeting, and what makes that legal?
Sure. There is a provision for an emergency meeting, but this is one instance where whether or not we should fire the basketball coach is not an emergency, even though those are sometimes the meetings which feel the most like an emergency. We're really truly talking about emergencies here. For example, we had the tornadoes rip through Pilgrim, a couple years back. They could hold an emergency meeting because they really did have an exigency there, which allowed them, and the whole purpose of the emergency meeting is to say, you can hold this whenever you need to, because we can't expect you in that circumstance to comply with the Open Meetings Act's requirements for notice and publication of when the meeting's going to be. So if you think of the whole purpose of the Open Meetings Act being that we provide the public as much notice and information as we possibly can. Basically, anything that's not an executive session is there for the public to see and to digest. The emergency meeting really does have to be something where you truly cannot comply with those requirements. So a tornado rips through town, yeah, that's probably an emergency meeting situation. We got a bomb threat. We've had circumstances where something like that could be an emergency situation. But when it's, when it's a matter that feels really important to everybody, that doesn't elevate it to the level of emergency. So yeah, you can have one, but in my 5 years practicing, I've only heard of one real true emergency meeting, at least that I'm aware of.
I had a true emergency meeting when I was at COZAD. I forget the name of the type of roof that they used to put on. They'd say about 15 years are gone. And all of a sudden, our roof it was like somebody dropped a marble on a mirror. Went up on the roof, and it was just spread out. And I had to get a roofer, and I had to get somebody to get the bids. And
Right.
so we had an emergency meeting. And it happened that one of our board members was a contractor, and they were just going to do the Camp Kamika roof. And he just switched. We lucked out, and I got some stuff from an architect about what the cost should be, and we went from there. So
Sure. Yep. There you go.
Enough of my war stories. Working with boards and understanding some of those legal requirements, what are some of the limitations of executive session? And you have kind of mentioned that. What are some words of wisdom you might have about executive session?
Sure. Well, kind of a two-part answer to that. Let's start with the technical part first. There are very technical requirements, assuming that your purpose for executive session, which is kind of the second part of this, assuming that is a legal purpose for executive session, there are technical requirements that you have to comply with in order to go in. For example, it has to be properly on the agenda. The item has to be properly described on the agenda. You've got to have a vote of the board. You have to have a two-part motion which says, here's our reason. Oh, and by the way, it's also in the public's interest to hold this in executive session. That has to be noted in the minutes. The roll call vote to go into executive session, then an admonishment from the board president that will only talk about the things within the context of that motion in the executive session, that if we need to take any action or talk about anything else, we'll come out of executive session. You have to note in the minutes the time you went into executive session, the time you come out of executive session. So I'm sure I'm forgetting a few of those, but for the most part, that's the process. It's complicated for a reason. These are supposed to be pretty rare circumstances in which you can use an executive session. So that's kind of the first part. And I don't know if you have anything to add there, Ken, but that's
Just saying a personnel issue is not enough, right?
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So to discuss the performance or discuss the evaluation of personnel, that is one of the, so there's as is typical of lawyers or legislatures, they have a list which is non-inclusive, right? A reason for executive session may include, but is not limited to. And so there are some specific things, like if you're going to talk about negotiations, how much are we going to increase the base salary next year? Those are sorts of discussions that you can have in executive session. Same with discussing the evaluation of personnel in pretty rare circumstances, for some other reasons. You don't want the board evaluating personnel other than the superintendent very often, but that's exactly right. You have to have enough specificity so that the public, and then in your motion that you make to go into executive session, the Attorney General could look at that on its face and say that both your agenda item and the wording of your motion and the admonishments of the president were legally sufficient to tell the public what you're going in to discuss.
One of the legal requirements of that then, negotiations, personnel, surveillance materials, purchase of property.
Yep.
What am I leaving out? That's about it.
That's pretty much it. Like I said, it's a short list. I recommend that, that as any administrator, you kind of commit that to memory, because you never know, even as a principal, when you're going to be sitting at that meeting and the superintendent's not there, and all of a sudden it's like, well, what do we do here? We got a situation that came up. So yeah, it's a limited list. I think you rattled off the ones that I would know off the top of my head. So think of it in terms of, we need a pretty good reason not to tell the public what we're doing. So if we're going to buy a house, let's say there's property next to the school, we want to build a new building and we're going to look to buy that property. we don't have to tell everybody, including the seller of the property, what we're comfortable as the board paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
So we can go into executive session and discuss how much or a range as a board that we're comfortable paying. Same with negotiations. And really, if you're going to go in to talk about a person, whether that's some sort of lawsuit that's been filed against the district, or talk about a personnel situation that is one of these rare circumstances where the board can be involved, you also have to notify that person that you're going to talk about. And you have to indicate that we're going to go in only to talk about this particular aspect of this, and it has to be a sufficiently, I guess, bad or scary reason such that it would damage that person's reputation to talk about it outside of the session. So of those 4 that you kind of rattled off, Ken, you can kind of see the policy reasons for why we can talk about money things, and then why we, if it's truly to protect somebody's reputation, we can go in to talk about them too.
Can that person, can they be involved in the executive session? Can they, even if the board doesn't want them, do they have a right to be in that meeting?
They don't have a right to go into executive session, but here's what happens often. We say, Mr. Superintendent, we're going to go talk about you in executive session because we had this issue come up where, we think we need to address it with the board before we talk to you. You have to give them the superintendent notice that you're going to go talk about the superintendent in executive session. That superintendent doesn't have the authority to say, I'm coming in with you, but they can request that the discussion be held in open session. So if the topic of the closed session is an individual, and like an employee, for example, we have to give them the right to hear what the board says if they want to. They can't invite themselves in if they allow us to do a closed session, but they can make you do an open session.
Okay.
A compromise in those cases, a political compromise, is often, well, let's do it in closed session, but we will invite you in.
Yeah, that's what. And we study a case where the teacher wanted an open session, I think to get community support. Maybe, I don't know what.
Sure. Yeah, rally the troops.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to advise the students that are future superintendents, that even though your board president is running the meeting, there's an expectation that if they're doing something legally wrong, that you'll step in and we talked about a case in Nebraska where this lady was going to resign her position, and one of the board members says, I'm not accepting the resignation. I move that we terminate. Bing, 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 bing. And well, what did they forget? They forgot the hearing.
Right.
So that principal got about $70,000 because of that. But somebody should step in and say, well, we're a step behind or ahead of ourselves, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
This is probably not the most important question we'll have, but can school board meetings be held off campus or out of the district?
They can. Yep. A school board can even hold a meeting out of state. They have to properly notice how they're going to do it. So the requirements, if you're going to hold a meeting someplace far away, are just a little bit different. But for example, we've had boards who have wanted to do their board retreat either in our office, or maybe they'll come to Lincoln and rent out a conference room and hotel to do their board retreat, to kind of eliminate those typical distractions that every board member and school employee has, when you're back at the district. You can do that. You have to properly notice the meeting. The public still has a right to attend. But you do not have to hold meetings, at the district every time. You can hold them someplace else.
I've heard it. A lot of schools that have a retreat out of the district, but can you take, I think I know the answer, but can you take action out of the district?
If it's been properly noticed, so that's a meeting. By any other definition, regardless of where you are, you're having a board meeting. If the meeting has been properly noticed and all that, you can take action, because the idea here is you're having a public meeting. You have to have it on the agenda. All that has to be squared away, just like as though you're sitting in the middle of your normal board meeting room. But yes.
We're having a board meeting in Matt Dot, Nebraska, and one of our board members wants to vote, but he's at a conference in Omaha. Can he electronically vote?
No. For a school board, there is no ability in Nebraska statutes, at least currently, to attend a meeting telephonically, much like you and I are now. While I think obviously the technology's there to make it work, I think any member of the public, if you and I were sitting in a meeting here, Ken, I think they would be able to, and this screen was, plastered in front of all the other board members in the public, they'd see it. They'd know that it's you, right? I'm a living, breathing person, but there's no authority in Nebraska statutes for a board member of a school board to participate either telephonically, via teleconference, via something like this, like Zoom or Skype. That can't happen, and obviously then they can't vote either. ESUs do have a little bit different laws. That's a recent change in the law that allows service units to have some more telephonic and video conferencing, ways to join a meeting that way.
Hey, we talked a little bit about contracts and tenure law. One of the questions that has come up in our class is some of the schools do an annual contract and others don't. What are the requirements of that, or what's your recommendation?
Yes, so in our experience, schools are all over the board with this too. Some schools literally hand a new contract every year. Some schools do nothing, and everything in between is legally acceptable. So under the teacher tenure statutes, we've got hard deadlines for a reason. If we get past April 15th, both parties are still in contract, right? If you haven't resigned, or if the district hasn't provided a notice of either non-renewal, cancellation, termination, both parties are then under contract for the next year. The idea here is that the way that the law is written is intended that, let's say that we have a teacher, this happened a couple years ago, that started teaching in 1975. That teacher has no other contract in her file other than the contract from 1975. Because Nebraska's law says essentially this: you collectively bargain every year. So the terms of the contract that the teacher has are updated by any updates to the collective bargaining agreement automatically. So they move on the salary schedule. We add a few more sick days, that the teachers can, or anybody in the bargaining unit can accrue. All of those things are automatically deemed to be included in that teacher's contract because they're part of the bargaining, the collective bargaining agreement. But there is no requirement that teacher actually put pen to paper and sign a new contract ever. So what a lot of schools will do is, in just to kind of, sorry, before I go into that, if you do change something in a contract, like as an administrator or a board, you decide, hey, this section that we wrote in 1975 really should be updated, or we should include something new in these contracts. If you do that outside of collective bargaining, then you are amending the contract of the teachers. So therefore, the obligations that you have to follow for amending a contract are actually very similar. You have to hold a hearing. They're similar to the rights that teacher has with respect to non-renewal of the contract. So this teacher that started in 1975 had only one contract in the file, but every year what the district would do is essentially send a little letter which said, your contract is continued again. We're past April 15th. Here's where we think you're going to be on the schedule. Here are going to be your extra duty assignments. Here's this letter where you just initial here that you got it. That's all that you need to do. And you really don't even have to do any of that. But I understand that it's nice to kind of formalize a little bit what the changes are going to be. But that's the reason we have continuing contract laws here in Nebraska, is it says you could have one contract in 1975, and then that's your contract until you're done. There's no obligation to hand a new contract or to hand anybody anything. That's why we have those hard deadlines in place in the Tenure Act.
But what about schools that their intention is to release teachers up to June 1st, or are they better off not to put something like that in their policy?
Yeah. What's really interesting, and I know you're probably speaking from experience here, Ken, is that you know that across the board, some schools intentionally change that April 15 date such that we are obligated by that date, unless the collective bargaining agreement for some reason allows us to give a teacher notice of non-renewal past April 15th. The NSEA is never going to go for that. But some districts will say we'll accept a resignation from a teacher up to May 1st or May 15th, or in some cases even June 1st. I've seen one which was August 1st, which is crazy because if you don't have a policy provision or practice in place where you accept resignations later, you can actually have an intent to return form distributed to teachers as early as March 15th. So why some schools elect to use May 1st or May 15th as the deadline by which a teacher must submit a resignation, but the board is still bound by the April 15th deadline, I'm not really sure. As an administrator, especially as a superintendent, and I got to find a new band teacher starting June 1st. That's going to be awfully tough to do.
Mm-hmm.
So why they do that, I don't know, but a lot of schools do. But in the absence of any past practice or provision, everybody's bound by that April 15th deadline.
This may not have been legal, but it seemed to work for us, is that after that June 1st date in there, that the requirement was that the teacher had to talk to the superintendent before they applied. Because there's nothing worse than have a teacher apply, and you really got to have that music teacher. You can't let them go.
Right.
And they apply to their hometown, and they're hurt, and you're feeling bad. And if you can tell them right up front, I just can't release you, I think it saves a lot of grief. But
definitely.
I have a scenario that I kind of suggested to you, that if a new principal comes into you as superintendent and realizes that evaluations haven't been done appropriately, but really feels like this teacher is going to have to improve, what recommendations would you have, and what would help our school attorney?
Sure. So if I got the call from a principal, or from maybe a principal and superintendent call in together and say, hey, I didn't realize that last principal, it really, the evaluations weren't done, or they weren't done appropriately, or we had all these issues that were never actually put into any evaluation. Because that's so clearly driven by statute, it is a due process requirement that we evaluate teachers appropriately, and we provide, concrete suggestions for improvement and all these things that are part of the tenure law. So if a principal came to me, or a superintendent called me and said, we didn't do that, point number one would be you need to start doing it immediately. Mm-hmm. At some point, the NSEA will concede. Let's say that we go to a termination hearing, or cancellation, or non-renewal hearing, for example. At some point, the NSEA will concede, well, you might not have done it appropriately in years 1 to 2. In years 3, 4, and 5, you did do it appropriately, so they still did have sufficient time to improve. So you didn't actually violate their due process rights. But if it's the situation where it's a second-year teacher going into the third year, principal starts the third year, and they say, we did not evaluate this person once each semester as a probationary employee, for example, I would say to them, it's a risk at this point, even if you got it right during that third year. It would be a pretty calculated risk to decide if the NSEA was going to challenge on whether we provided sufficient due process to that teacher, because we didn't comply with the teacher tenure statutes with respect to evaluation. So I would say, unless it's something that is a cancelable offense, like even if we messed up the evaluations for 2 years, but the teacher, hauled off and shoved a kid into a locker, that's a cancellation, which is really as contingent on yeah. But if what you're talking about, Ken, is the call that I get is, this is just a poor performing teacher, or somebody we don't think is competent to teach in this district. If we haven't done the evaluations correctly, step number 1, start doing them correctly. Step number 2, go back and try to re-evidence as much of that as you can in an improvement plan, or something like that, to try to capture some of those issues and make your best argument that while we didn't do it right in years 1 and 2, we really made clear in year 3 what the issues were, and they continued. But as we get to, March 1st, and we're trying to decide, we got an April 15th deadline, are we comfortable with what we've done in this third year to try to erase the mistakes of the past? I've seen a lot of cases where the answer to that is no. So we are conceding that teacher now has tenure, even though our superintendent, new principal, believe they might not be competent to teach.
And that issue happens once in a while.
Absolutely, it does. And you're a new principal that comes in, and that happens. That's why, and I just want to add this small caveat, if you don't mind. If I'm a superintendent evaluating principals, I ask in every single principal evaluation, I ask them to bring the evaluation from their best teacher and their worst teacher. Those two evaluations should look markedly different. Mm-hmm. You should have a lot of check marks in the column which says not meeting district standards. And even in the teacher that is your best teacher, if it truly is your best teacher, they probably do want you to provide them ways to continue to improve. So in every evaluation, you should have something to work on. No teacher is just proficient all the way down the line. No comments need to be made. That's unfair to the teacher, and it's unfair to the students. So a way to kind of stave that off, Ken, I think, is if I'm the superintendent, any principal, whether it's a 15th year or a first year, I say bring in your best evaluation, your best and worst teachers, and let's include those as part of your evaluation as principal.
That's a great idea. One of my schools, I inherited a narrative evaluation, and that's why I finally had to tell my 4 principals, I can't tell the difference. And
right.
We changed. They were willing to. So but I understand what you're saying. That's a good strategy. Any state law changes or cases outside of the things that a future superintendent should know?
Yeah, well, so we've had a lot of changes. For example, one of the things that I won't spend much time on that maybe you've talked about is the new negotiations timeline. That's something that, it's pretty deadline driven now. And the idea is we used to have negotiations for the current year or even for the past year that dragged on for a year or two. So let's say that we were talking about the 14-15 school year. We might get into 2016, even 2017, before we actually went to the Commission of Industrial Relations and settled what the 14-15 year was going to be. So the purpose of these changes to the law now, and what I would absolutely commit to memory as a new administrator and especially new superintendent, is you're going to be shepherding your board through this process. One, make clear the role that your board wants you to have in negotiations. Some boards want to send in a team of 3. Some boards want you and the board president to go in and negotiate. It varies widely. Clarify what your role is first so that you don't either create expectations that you're not going to meet or so you don't step on the toes of your board members that had a different idea about that. And number 2, commit those new deadlines and new obligations that the board has to memory. For example, there's now this resolution officer process. We bargain for a few months, we can't agree. We have to go to what amounts to a mediator to try to figure out what's going to happen. If we haven't appropriately raised an issue in our couple of months of bargaining, that mediator can't make a decision on it. So let's say the board wants to get rid of some weird old provision and they don't bring it up at all, but then they get to this mediator and say, we'd like to take this out. That person has to say, no, I can't. You have to have raised it before. So this new negotiations timeline makes it imperative that you get on the same page with the board for what your negotiation strategy is going to be. And really, you're doing that in the beginning of the year for the next year, whereas you used to have, months on end to kind of get that in place. So that's a change that I'd certainly recommend committing to memory. A couple others that I wrote down, just stuff that you're absolutely going to deal with, are the constitutional rights of students and teachers. We've got new cases all over the place now, and especially with the advent of social media. What can a teacher say? When can they say it? When does that become something that can impact their employment with the district? All of those are pretty kind of fluid, ever-changing questions. And so we've got a lot of that stuff happening. So the First Amendment rights of teachers and students are things that we deal with weekly and that we get calls from administrators. So at what point, when 2 students are fighting on Facebook over the weekend, can we impose consequences at school? You've probably talked about these cases, the Tinker armband case where we need the material and substantial disruption. There are cases coming out literally almost every month, sort of reevaluating and trying to apply that standard to things like social media. So I think you should never stop learning in those 2 areas. And one that you and I kind of talked about before, and I don't know if you want to launch into it or not, but we'll talk about transgender students here in a second. But before we do, one thing I want to say is if I'm going to be a new superintendent, whether for the first time or if I'm changing schools, one of the things I recommend is you've got that period where let's say they hire you in February and you're going to be coming in. So you start going to the March, April, May board meetings to get acquainted and to kind of figure out where the district's at. You'll start your budgeting process. I recommend every new superintendent read every word of every policy and handbook before you start. July is sort of the month where we do policy updates anyway. You'll get all the unicameral sessions over. We have the legal changes. You've usually got some vacation days from the job that you're leaving, right, or the position that you're leaving to take an administrator job. Take a couple of vacation days, and if you can't read every word of the policies and handbooks in 2 business days, those are going to be a project for you at your new job anyway. So do that. So definitely read, because it shocks me how many times a superintendent that's been at a district for 20 years, and I say, well, what does your FERPA policy say with respect to directory information? And they say, well, gee, I don't know. So you need to read those policies because the legal effect is significant. And whenever you talk to me or any other school lawyer, we're going to say, well, what does your policy say?
Mm-hmm.
So with that, if you've got anything else for me to hit, Ken, I can, but I think the transgender issue you had mentioned.
Yeah, the one thing that we just had studied a case or several cases about cell phone searches, that basically they're saying get a warrant if it's, I don't know if that's the recommendations you make, but a couple of cases that was presented by our class the other day was where the courts had ruled you didn't have a good reason to search that phone.
Yeah. Well, we've had, there's been I don't know if you guys talked about it. It was a criminal case, but it was the Riley case. It was the Supreme Court
that's
case,
the one. Yeah.
where basically they said if you search a kid's cell phone, that's like searching their house. The house is, your sanctuary. It's where the cops can't come search without really, really good reason to do so, without probable cause. And even then, you've got more protections in your house than you do in your car, even though the legal standard is still probable cause. So they've compared the cell phone to the home. So our advice to schools is follow, you need to follow the TLO case, if you guys talked about that, where you have the zigzags in the purse, and now, and we found marijuana, and, were we allowed to search it? Trying to apply that to cell phones is tough. So you really, really do need to have your T's crossed and I's dotted. What is the suspected rule violation? Do we have reasonable suspicion to believe it's there? And I think an important third question that often gets left out, is there another less intrusive way to get the same information? So if one student comes up and says, this person sent me this mean Facebook message while we were on the bus on the way to a basketball game, why not have that person provide a screenshot instead of going and hauling off and searching the cell phone? So I think if you sort of look at it as the two-part analysis, it needs to be reasonable at its inception. We do think there's a violation, reasonable in its scope. We're not going to start searching Twitter if we know that the message was allegedly sent on Facebook. And each new compartment that you go into. So if he's got drugs in his backpack, but they're in a pencil case in a Ziploc bag, we need to have suspicion for every one of those new compartments. Think of a cell phone the same way. You need suspicion to get into the cell phone. You need suspicion to open up one of the kid's apps, because you're basically, the Supreme Court has said that's the equivalent of searching that kid's underwear drawer at that point, right? You're in their home. So add that third step. Is there a way to get the same evidence? And if a student comes in and shows us his cell phone and says, look at this message he sent, do we really need any more evidence? The evidentiary standard for schools is pretty low. You can punish if you think it's more likely than not that there's been a violation of school rules. So sorry to kind of give a long-winded answer there, but it's an area that we study a lot because we get a lot of questions about, can we search that phone? You really, really need to tread lightly. And this is not me just pandering for business. I really think a 3-4 minute conversation with your school attorney can answer a lot of that stuff for you. As an administrator, you're expected to be an expert on a lot of areas of law in addition to all your other obligations. That's tough. It's tough applying 100-page Supreme Court cases in a matter of 10 seconds and making that decision. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Are you being approached about transgender policies, or where are you at on that?
We are. And so in addition to just transgender students, we've got this whole concept of whether or not you can discriminate against anybody, a student, an employee of the district, based on their gender identity. So not their sex, right? If you think of Title VI and Title VII, the list of things that we can't discriminate on, right? Sex, race, national origin, disability, all of these things that we have to stay away from. Gender is not included on that list. So it's this really big concept out there that is definitely, obviously, in society's eye at this point. And so we've got courts essentially asking the question of, is gender encompassed in the word sex in those policies? We've had boards of education that have said, because one of the biggest issues, certainly athletic participation, and I'm sure you've talked to the class or will about a lot of states are now passing policies at their activity association level, determining eligibility for those kiddos. But a more important decision as a superintendent and the board that you're going to have to make are, what do we want to say in our policy if we have one? Number one, by having a policy, you almost concede that that's a protected class. The Office of Civil Rights will definitely say that it is, but so far we don't have a court that's clearly said gender is a protected class of people. So if you're going to have a policy, the questions you're going to be answering, and the questions we get a lot, Ken, from boards and superintendents, what do we do about bathroom use? What do we do about locker room use? What if we've got a staff member that the day before the end of the first semester says, I know I'm John today, but actually when I come back, I'm going to be Susan, right? We've had that issue happen several times where it's actually a staff member that says, oh, by the way, I'm a kindergarten teacher, and so I'm going to come back and continue to teach kindergarten. I'm going to look the same, but try explaining to a class of kindergartners that John is now Susan. And so those issues exist all over the place. So as you're thinking through these things, I think as a board and especially as an administration, you get to think practically. When you're in a court, it won't be so much about practical, it'll be legal. So if you're thinking about having a policy, really think practically through how do we want to do it, what sort of risk are we willing to take on. And the few court cases that we've got coming out now, there's a case in Virginia where a board passed a policy and they said you have to use the bathroom and locker room facilities that are consistent with your sex at birth. So if you're a male at birth, you need to use the male facilities even though you may be a transgendered or transition to a female. So far the court agreed with the school in that case. And so we've got this big fight coming. So if it was me, what we tell our clients at this point, if you can, hold off on passing a big wholesale policy, because I think, in a matter of a few years, we will have more of a firm understanding of what the law actually is. Because at this point, you've got federal government agencies saying you should treat gender as a protected class. We don't have a court or a legislature that said that anywhere. And so if I'm a new superintendent, my advice to my board now, or what I would tell a client is, sit tight. If you got a situation that comes up, you get some deference from courts because you're the educational experts. Think practically. Use your experience on how to deal with that. I'd hold off on the policy for now.
I think they mentioned last night that there are two states that have done the birth certificate policy, which birth certificate says, but in Georgia and Idaho, I think.
Yep.
But if in Georgia says if you have proof from a doctor that you've actually had the surgery,
right,
then they'll accept that. But one of the issues that and this is getting longer than I should let it go, but one of the issues that I am concerned about is what's the supervision at a volleyball game when this transgender person ends up showing up. Playing, and you can control the students, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah, but controlling the crowd about the comments about having a transgender volleyball player is going to be, that's a form of harassment, I would assume. But
yeah.
Anyway, well, I probably wrap this up. I got a grandson here that's he came in to say, "Can I have some pop?" Anyway, Bobby, I sure appreciate your help on this. Really, your approach was just exactly what I wanted, is looking through the eyes of a prospective superintendent and some of the things that they'll run into. I may be catching you again on the negotiations for the finance class.
Sure. That's great. I'm happy to do it. Like I said, I think our clients are the best in the world. So if I can help in any way, you let me know.
Okay. Well, I sure appreciate it. And thank you again.
You bet. Thank you.